Well, we're here again, and it's time for more fun with dysfunctional reproductive systems. And now we move over to the world of males. What were the themes that came through the previous lecture? The complexity, the cost of the female reproductive axis, and the mere fact that major chronic stress, and this is no time for it. As we'll see, some of the same exact themes with males. And we saw one example of it already in the previous lecture, which was that business about women who do tons of athletics, women who are starving, that business about fat stores dropping down. And mentioning that business in passing, males don't do that androgen to estrogen conversion we were talking about, but nonetheless, when males do tons of athletics, as mentioned on the average male runners who run 45, 50 miles a week, for other mechanisms that we will hear about, sperm count tends to go down, number of viable sperm as well, testicular size, this theme that we've already recognized. Now, switching over to making sense of the male reproductive system and the effects of stress, it's not just pertinent to runners. It's not just pertinent to extreme exercise. It comes up in all sorts of realms. And it's the same exact lesson once again. You can do this one readily and tell the themes short term, you're running for your life, make your sperm some other time, do it chronically, and you are going to pay a price. Now, what it all revolves around is testosterone. Testosterone, this key hormone, this key steroidal hormone that comes out of the testes. Yes, you know the drill by now in terms of an axis, the hypothalamus to pituitary to testes, but the place to start is emphasizing that when you look at this version in males, it's just a lot simpler than in females. To wit, the male brain is just a whole lot simpler than the female brain, at least when it comes to reproductive physiology. Why is this the case? It's because female brains and the female reproductive axis has to do something much fancier than the male. They have to have cyclic release. They have to have things churning along, and right around day 14, there's massive changes in the levels of this and that, and that takes some very fancy wiring. The male brain, in contrast, all it needs to do is just dribble out a certain amount of testosterone on a regular basis. It's much more of a flat level. And this is brought about predominantly during fetal life when fetal brains are either intentionally or inadvertently poisoned with androgens. You wind up with a simpler male brain, one where testosterone release is fairly constant over time. Of course, it's not absolutely constant throughout. It responds to experience. You get some guy who's facing off against his worst rival on the whole planet, and he crushes him, defeats him at chutes and ladders, and he is going to have this atavistic surge of testosterone will make him glow like a baboon on the savannah with sharp canines. Yes, it responds to that, but for the most part, males are these lumpen endocrine creatures. You get a stimulus like that, you get a 3-, 4-, 5-fold difference in testosterone levels, and you look at females, and there's these massive fluctuations again, so the female reproductive system is much more complex than in the male. Nonetheless, amid that simplicity, the male reproductive system is vulnerable to is vulnerable to stress in some of the same exact ways. And as you would guess already, with the onset of stress, down go testosterone levels. Same theme as with the reproductive hormones in females like estrogen. Your testes do not know what they are doing. Back to the earlier lectures, they are not autonomous glands, but instead it's that same business axis starting in the brain to the pituitary to the testes. So which hormones are relevant? And weirdly, it's almost the exact same hormones as in the female. From the pituitary out comes LH and FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And since men don't have follicles, you're not stimulating follicles with FSH, you're stimulating the production of sperm. LH, luteinizing hormone, is predominantly responsible for stimulating testosterone production. Same exact deal as in females. The pituitary doesn't know what it's doing either. So back up in the brain, same hormone again, LHRH, luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone. We've got our basic axis here. So the simplified male brain in its sort of constant state of hormone release does its LHRH business, LH and FSH from the pituitary, out goes testosterone. Now, the basic theme that runs throughout all of this is, you guessed it, with the onset of stress, down go testosterone levels. You take some guy and you put him through surgery, he's anesthetized, you slice into his belly with a scalpel, and within 10 minutes or so, testosterone levels are going down. You take first-year male medical students during their final exams, and down go testosterone levels, which you may want to take as a cautionary point if any of you males out there are pre-meds. It doesn't come cheap. Another realm in which testosterone goes down takes a male baboon who sits there way up on top of the hierarchy and do some vicious manipulative things so the guy drops in the hierarchy. Down go testosterone levels built around the stress of that circumstance. Now, here's a stressor which, thank God, I have no personal experience with whatsoever, but apparently it's not fun to be in the Marines. Apparently it's kind of a drag, in fact, especially during military training. And this was this classic study, 1970, New England Journal of Medicine, looking at military officers' training during those first couple of months. And now, in addition to all the other indignities, these guys had to pee into these little Dixie cups where the psychiatrist would then take over and the endocrine people would analyze the hormone levels. And back comes the finding that you look at guys during the first couple of months in the Marines, and they've got the circulating testosterone levels of newborn babies. And you may want to keep that in mind the next time you're in a bar and there's some leatherneck bragging about his androgen levels, and just get him up to date on modern endocrinology, and maybe he'll even buy you a drink. Probably not, no need to mention my name. But what we see here are all these circumstances where testosterone levels go down. So, of course, as usual, we have to ask the question, what are the mechanisms? Which hormones released during stress mess with this testicular system? And it's some of the exact same culprits as with the female system. Glucocorticoids, working at the level of the brain to decrease the release of that luteinizing hormone, releasing hormone. Glucocorticoids working down at the testes to make those testes less sensitive to whatever pituitary signals are coming out. That same theme again, less messenger coming out of the brain and the pituitary, less sensitivity in the pituitary and testes to these signals. Interesting additional hormone that becomes relevant, and it's one that's now been mentioned a few times in the last lecture, for example, beta-endorphin. Beta-endorphin, another hormone that's released during stress, and we saw that beta-endorphin has some anti-reproductive effects in females, virtually the same thing in males. And around this point, you begin to try to put some pieces together. Okay, beta-endorphin, hormone we haven't mentioned much yet, a hormone that is going to dominate the coming lecture about stress and pain, because beta-endorphin is your brain's equivalent, your brain's chemical equivalent of morphine. Morphine, heroin, pain-blocking drugs like opiates, beta-endorphin, endogenous morphine. And of course, there's a whole world of people out there who abuse opioids like that. So you suddenly come up with this wondering question here. Do people who are morphine, heroin, opium addicts, do they have problems with their reproductive systems? Absolutely. That is absolutely the case in males and females. Okay, so we have lots of these steps going on here, doing in sensitivity to the hormone, doing in the release of the relevant hormones, and the net result is less testosterone. So at this point, you have to ask a very critical question. And this is one that goes through all the physiology. There's a tendency to be very impressed with the change in the levels of some hormone or some brain chemical or activating of some gene or suppressing of some gene or doing something rather to some enzyme. And people consume entire careers being excited about the minutia of this and how. And somewhere along the way, you have to ask this very out-of-date sort of question that runs through physiology, which is, well, what are the consequences of this? What are the physiological consequences? And thus, we must ask the question here, what are the consequences of testosterone levels going down during stress? And you can imagine all sorts of things. Males have all sorts of problems, and aggression goes down, and all sorts of things that happen at that point, not working very well. And when you look at it, there in fact is a very surprising finding, which is there are no consequences of testosterone levels going down during stress. And just to prove it, my voice just cracked in a peripubescent way. There's no consequences. Testosterone turns out to be this vastly overrated hormone. It's virtually superfluous. You need basically a thimbleful of the stuff and a couple of sperm to be in business. Testosterone really is not that interesting. You've got to knock down levels of it enormously in order to impair fertility. What does stress do? It knocks down levels, but typically nowhere near in the range to mess up testosterone and fertility. So the consequences there are pretty clear. There's not much in the way of consequences. So where are the consequences? And it turns out the problems during stress are not that testosterone levels go down. The problem is that penises go down. Am I allowed to talk about penises in Fairfax County? Okay, I just got the thumbs up from the team of teaching company lawyers standing just away from this fine dark wood set. And we're all set now to finally, so many lectures in this course, to talk about erections. How do erections work? Turns out, in a very complicated way. No surprise, very complicated way. The thing that you have to do for starters is a spinal cord. And we heard earlier on, the spinal cord carries information from the brain signaling to voluntary muscles, and that's that boring world of the voluntary nervous system doing the foxtrot, etc. That's not the part that's interesting, and you can guess immediately what becomes relevant, the autonomic nervous system. All that stuff that we normally can't consciously control, goose flesh, blushing, all of that, this is where erections come in. Now, we had a theme in these earlier lectures when first learning about this autonomic nervous system, which is those two halves, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic, arousal, emergency, stress, adrenaline, parasympathetic, calm, vegetative function. And what we saw in these earlier lectures are the extent to which these two systems work in opposition. You want to activate the cardiovascular stress response, increasing blood pressure, increasing heart rate, all that sort of thing. And we saw a great example of the autonomic nervous system working in opposition. What do? You activate the sympathetic nervous system and you inhibit the parasympathetic. And in fact, when you look at the systems there in more details, activating the sympathetic sends actively a pathway, a collateral projection that inhibits the parasympathetic. When you activate the parasympathetic, there's a collateral that comes off that inhibits the sympathetic nervous. What do you see here? This is a mechanism to guarantee that you never inadvertently put your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. So opposition there, heart function. Same thing, but with a very different twist. Same thing that we saw earlier in terms of gastrointestinal tract. What we saw was with the onset of stress, with the onset of activation of the sympathetic nervous system, you decrease activity in your gastrointestinal system. That whole business, your stomach contracts less peristaltic directional contraction in your small intestines. We got that small footnote about the increased activation down there in the large intestines and getting rid of the dead weight. But the main point there is, in this case, the sympathetic nervous system pulls off its stress response by decreasing activity in the gastrointestinal system. Parasympathetic does exactly this theme again and again of sympathetic and parasympathetic working in opposition. When you get to the world of erections, things suddenly work differently. This is the first time where there's not a clear opposition, but instead there's amazing choreography that goes on. So here's the deal. In male primates the world over, you need to activate the parasympathetic nervous system in order to get an erection. And very broadly, erections come in two different flavors. There's what's called a hemodynamic erection, and what goes on there is you get an erect penis by way of increased blood flow. More blood goes into the penis, you decrease the blood flow out of there, and you got yourself an erect penis. In the other cases, it's a muscular erection. There's this muscle called the levator ani muscle, and what it does is when it gets stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system, it contracts and up goes the penis, like during, pulling up a sail or some such thing. Humans have the hemodynamic, rodents have the muscular. Muscular happens faster, lasts shorter, humans last longer, take your pick. But nonetheless, in both cases, it's driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. So how do erections and then ejaculation work? Here's what you got. Parasympathetic activity. So you've managed to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system, you are calm and vegetative, and you got yourself your erection now. So what happens next? Maybe something having to do with the social context that brought about the erection in the first place. Maybe for some obscure, inexplicable reason, you begin to feel a little bit less calm and vegetative. Maybe your heart's beginning to beat faster. Maybe you're starting to breathe faster. Maybe you're beginning to exert some muscular exercise activity thing. What are you doing? You are slowly turning on the sympathetic nervous system. More time goes by, more activation of it, more heart rate, more cardiovascular, and eventually you are blasting with your cardiovascular tone. Your heart's beating fast, blood pressure, you're sweating, your toes are curling, you're exercising like crazy. Eventually reach this point where your whole body is screamingly sympathetic, except for this one lone outpost where you're desperately holding on to parasympathetic tone as long as possible. Finally, you can't take it anymore. You turn off the parasympathetic, you turn on the sympathetic, and you ejaculate. Okay, so that's how erections work. That's how erections work. And what happens during stress? What happens during stress? It's perfectly obvious. You're not feeling all that calm and vegetative. You can't turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. And suddenly, you got this problem there of stress-induced impotency. But there's a second problem that might come in. Suppose you manage to pull things off and you've got yourself this erection and things are starting just fine, and suddenly you think, oh my God, the dollar exchange rate for the euro, and something happens, and suddenly you get all anxious and you accelerate that transition from the parasympathetic to the sympathetic. What happens then is premature ejaculation. So you've got this whole world of vulnerability, and this is a world of extraordinary vulnerability. Erectile dysfunction, either you can't get the erection or you have this problem with premature ejaculation. It is incredibly easy for this to occur. Current estimates are 60% of the doctor's visits in this country are due to not organic cases of impotency, but to psychogenic, stress-related. Now, mind you, a number like that you've got to take with a certain degree of skepticism. Anytime you say stuff like psychogenic instead of organic, at some point or other, all cases of erectile dysfunction were psychogenic in nature. What does that mean? Nobody had discovered an organic explanation yet, and as one gets more and more organic explanations, the incidence of psychogenic go down. Given these caveats, nonetheless, this is a system that is spectacularly vulnerable to stress effects. So now we have this challenge, which is how to tell the difference between an organic case of erectile dysfunction or a psychogenic case. And here's where you finally get something useful out of this damn course where you should take notes. Here's where we see how you make this differential diagnosis. Okay, some guy comes in, and he's complaining about how he hasn't been able to have an erection during sex in the last 6 months. And you think, well, is this organic in basis? Maybe the guy has a pituitary tumor or something wrong with his spinal autonomic projection, some such thing. Or is it psychogenic? You're trying to distinguish between the two. And here's what you do. You take advantage of a totally weird thing that male primates do, at least as weird as that business about female primates secreting a certain amount of male sex hormones. Now this weird thing that male primates do, including human males, which is when they go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, they get erections. I have no idea why. I've talked to Earth's experts, penis experts, and none of them have a good explanation. Nonetheless, males get REM sleep erections. Nothing you can do about it. So here you are, you've got this guy where you can't tell if he has a case of psychogenic or organic erectile dysfunction. Here's what you do. You give him this handy-dandy little penile pressure cuff transducer thingy, which he puts down on the base of his penis at night just before he goes to sleep, and he wires it up and satellite relays and 24-hour operators in Bangalore. And the next morning, you got your answer, which is, if this guy hasn't had an erection in sex in the last 6 months, yet 30 seconds into his first REM stage, this guy doesn't have a brain tumor, it is psychogenic. That's how you distinguish between the two. Do you still get the nocturnal erections? Do you still get the erections during REM sleep? Show that pattern, and it is psychogenic in nature. So that's very easy to differentiate between the two. Actually, it's not so easy to differentiate the two if you really think about it, because you got this electronic device on your penis there, and it's beeping and wires, and you're so sure it's going to electrocute you during the night that that's a stressor in and of itself. Here is what you do instead. And this is actually what is done most commonly in sexual dysfunction clinics, a wonderfully elegant piece of diagnostic approach. Here's what you do instead. You take a string of postage stamps, and you lick them at one end, and you wrap them around the guy's penis. He goes to sleep, and the next morning, if the stamps have been torn loose at one end, the guy had an erection during the night. Can you believe how elegant that is? Forget, electronic devices and cutting-edge tech. All you need is a bunch of postage stamps. It's wonderful, like $5, and you get a medical diagnosis. It's great. And, of course, insurance isn't going to pay for it, but someday that will change in this country. So what you see here is a domain of great vulnerability to stress effects in terms of testosterone levels going down. Not such a big deal, as we saw in terms of consequence. Erectile dysfunction in terms of problems having an erection. Once you have it, accelerated transition from parasympathetic to sympathetic, premature ejaculation, that problem there. And this challenge of differentiating between when erectile dysfunction is due to some sort of organic problem, and when it is due instead to some sort of psychogenic problem. And the cutting-edge thing that makes one like me proud to be a biomedical researcher, the role of postage stamps in modern medicine. So all of this is great. We have a great deal of insight now into how the male body falls apart during stress. And as we saw, probably the most influential piece of that is that business about the sympathetic nervous system as activated during stress, making it very hard to have an erection. And most of the time when you see problems with this, again, they appear to be psychogenic in nature. So this is a universal. This is how everything works, except there's one interesting case where you get exceptions, which is we've got this logic by now, running for your life, the predator coming after you, you have better things to do than, make sperm, you're in the middle of some socially stressful period. But there's one area where it actually doesn't make sense to inhibit the male testicular system. Suppose you are some male moose or something at the top of the dominance hierarchy. You've just fought your way to the top, and it is mating season, and there are males challenging you left and right, and lots of fighting and butting of heads, and very stressful, very stressful. What a disaster it would be if you have this whole period of fighting like mad, being stressed like mad, in order to come out in dominant position and get the chance to mate, and you can't get the chance to mate because your whole testicular system is suppressed there. In cases like that, there are mechanisms by which the reproductive system in males are protected from that particular type of stress. Nonetheless, in circumstance after circumstance, what we see is stress of all sorts of forms, physical or psychogenic, shutting down the reproductive system. And again, probably the most important step in there is hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, and you're not going to get an erection. So this appears to be universal until you suddenly find one species where it doesn't quite work this way. And it is time, finally, oh so many lectures in this course, it is time that we finally talked about hyenas. Okay, hyenas. What's the deal with hyenas? Hyenas, spotted hyenas, have horrible public relations problems because of how all of us think about hyenas. To the extent that any of us think about hyenas, and I assume most of us do, hyenas, what's the scenario? It's one of those Marlin Perkins Wild Kingdom type scenes there where it's dawn on the savannah. And you open up and there's some carcass of something or other and a whole bunch of lions eating on it, and you get close-ups of them, drooling in excitement, and it is wonderful. And then you suddenly see, right on the edge of those lions there, you see them, those skeevy hyenas, those scavengers looking for a chance to run in there and get a scrap of meat. Hyenas are scavengers. They're not real hunters, and all of us root for hunters instead of scavengers, which is pretty odd since what most of us are scavengers as we go up and down the meat aisle in the supermarket. Not a lot of us have taken down our kills with our canines. Nonetheless, we love those lions, and there are those skeevy hyenas lurking around on the edge looking for a little piece of something dead where they had nothing to do with bringing it down. This turns out to be nonsense. This turns out to be this horrible bit of, urban legend going against our admiration for the hyenas. It turns out hyenas are great hunters. They're extremely organized hunters with high success rates. And the reason why people really didn't appreciate it for a long time was looking at lions through rose-colored glasses and the fact that hyenas are nocturnal predators. So you have these hyenas, and they've taken down a kill, and it turns out lions are not very good at hunting. They're big, they're conspicuous, they're relatively slow. They have a much lower success rate than you see in hyenas. What lions are really good at is booting hyenas off of their kill. So here you have the hyenas who've brought down the kill, and the lions come in and boot them off, the lions who are now the scavengers, and in comes Marlin Perkins with the film crew, and no wonder the hyenas are looking all skeevy out on the edge of things. They're the ones who were up all night hunting, and who's having the steaks now? So hopefully what this has done is pulled out a high degree of sympathy towards the poor maligned hyena, which is a good thing now because what I'm about to tell you may wipe out that sympathy because hyenas are really weird. Hyenas break all the rules of what boys and girls are supposed to be about. For a simple reason, not so simple, but for a very clear reason, hyenas have a sex reversal dominant system. What do I mean by this? Among hyenas, females have more muscle than males. Females tend to be more aggressive. Amazingly, females have higher levels of one type of androgen, one type of male sex hormone. Females are socially dominant to males. And here's the weirdest thing. Females have genitals that look just like those in males. They have something or other gets erect there, and they have something or other that looks like a scrotum, and it's totally bizarre. And it turns out they really don't have erections in a scrotum. What they have is not a penis, but a clitoris, and they get clitoral erections, and they don't really have testes. They have these compacted fat cells that kind of look like, and it's all totally bizarre. And what it's all about is this weird androgenization of female hyenas. So you can't even tell, what gender one of them is. As I think I've mentioned, I do research some of the time on baboons in Africa. And over the years, I've shared camp with a scientist from Berkeley who is the world's expert on hyena clitorises. Centuries will go by, and it will be impossible to talk about the subject without mentioning this man's name. He is as wise on the subject as you can get. And you would see these cases there in camp where he's darted and anesthetized some hyena, and he drags it into camp and looks down in there, and he's got his binoculars, and it takes him a long time to say, well, I think this one's a boy or this one's a girl. They've got this bizarre sex reversal system that involves androgenization of the genitals in the female. Weird, utterly weird, except it turns out it makes sense, which is among lots of social carnivores out there, you give birth to a large number of kids, a litter of a dozen lion cubs, and what you've got then is this vicious competition for food where the majority of those cubs don't make it to age 1. For a bunch of gynecological reasons, hyenas only have a couple of pups, a pair of pups, and you get that low of a number, and you are suddenly under big evolutionary pressure to get those kids to survive. And suddenly, some hyena, way back when, got a mutation, probably in the ovaries, where they now start pumping out lots of those androgens, not the piddly levels we heard about in the previous lecture. They pump out lots of these androgens, and suddenly you've got a female who is big and snarly and muscular and aggressive, and suddenly she is the one who gets to feed her kids. You've got a bunch of hyenas who take down and kill a bunch of male hyenas, and in come the females and